Mrs. Karen McDonald-Gale, Chief Executive Officer, Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, Ms. Tanya Liu, Conservation Finance Manager, Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. Our national coordinators of the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program implemented by UNDP. I want to especially recognize Kate Ventura and Hyacinth Douglas. Dr. Mohammed Nagdi, Cluster Head, Sustainable Solutions, Energy, and Climate Change, of course, the Climate Change Program, and our other colleagues of the UNDP Multi-Country Office for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Representatives from various regional conservation trusts, special mention the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund, Biodiversity and Protected Areas Management, Belize Fund for a Sustainable Future, St. Vincent and the Grenadines Conservation Trust Fund, Regional Activity Center for Specially Protected Areas, Wildlife of the Caribbean. We must acknowledge our special development partners in the room, our SGP grantee partners, of course, specially invited guests, members of the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning once again, and a warm welcome to the Caribbean Biodiversity Financing Conference and Knowledge Fair. Of course, under the theme, Financing Nature, Collaboration and Investment for Caribbean Biodiversity. Now, my name is Dr. David Bino, and I'm the National Coordinator of the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program, of course, implemented by UNDP. But I'm also your Master of Ceremonies for today. It is with great pleasure, therefore, that I stand before you as we gather here today to address a very critical issue that besets us in our region, the issue of biodiversity conservation. This event in itself serves as a platform for stakeholders from diverse backgrounds. As you look around the room, you can see it clearly. For us to come together and share knowledge and explore innovative solutions to protect and preserve our natural heritage is an occasion that underscores the importance of collaboration, of finance, and investment in driving meaningful change towards a sustainable future that we all want. Now, it's important that I note that this particular event is not a standalone event, but it's really a continuation of the excellent work that many of our partners have been doing across the region. And on behalf of our Jeff SGP Global Manager Yoko Watanabe and our regional focal point, Angelica Shimarina, I extend a heartfelt appreciation to the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund as a joint partner in this very important event. The Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program implemented by UNDP is really, we are very moved, not only by the evidence that you've been doing some great work in the region, but by your strong and continued partnership that you've built with us. And we see this as really a catalyst for something even greater. We also thank you for your unwavering commitment to biodiversity conservation and your vision and visionary leadership in promoting finance mechanisms that benefit both nature and our economies. They go hand in hand. Solutions to one must be solutions to all. I also want to express our gratitude to distinguished panelists, experts, and delegates in attendance. Your presence today demonstrates your dedication to the cause and your belief in the power of collective action, which we all need. Now, over the course of this conference and knowledge fair, we will engage in very insightful discussions and expect you to participate very meaningfully. We'll also explore best practices and learn from one another's experience. That's important, experiential learning. Together, we will delve into the creation and development of debt for nature swaps, innovative mechanisms that hold immense potential in bridging the gap between environmental preservation and economic debt relief. But we'll also focus on the operationalization and the inclusive implementation of these financial instruments. ensuring that their benefit reach not some, but all stakeholders, especially local communities and those most affected, marginalized populations. Now, this event is not just an opportunity for knowledge exchange, it is really a call to action. Let us seize this moment to inspire one another, to forge partnerships, and to drive transformational change in our policies, our practices, and investments. By working collaboratively, we can safeguard the unique biodiversity the Caribbean region has to offer. We can foster sustainable development and leave a legacy of resilience for future generations to come. Therefore, I encourage you all to actively participate, share insights, and engage in this fruitful discussion. Let us capitalize on the collective wisdom in this room and emerge with innovative financing ideas. We need them. And actionable strategies that will shape a brighter and greener future for our Caribbean. Once again, I extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. May this conference and knowledge fair be a source of inspiration, collaboration, and a lasting impact. Let's embark on this journey together. Thank you and God bless.
Good morning to everyone. Karolin Troubetzkoy is the Executive Director, Marketing and Operation for Anse Chastenay and Jade Mountain Resorts in Soufrière, St. Lucia. She has been spearheading the marketing and day-to-day operations of these award-winning resorts since 1986, with Jade Mountain Resort added in 2004. Mrs. Troubetzkoy was appointed President of the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association in January 2016 and was only the second woman to serve as president of the CHDA's 50-plus year history. When her CHDA presidency came to an end in 2018, she agreed to take on the role of chairperson of the CHDA's Education Foundation, and in this position continues fundraising in the industry to make available scholarships and training opportunities. In September 2022, the Board of Directors of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund elected Mrs. Troubetzkoy as their new chairperson. She is the Honorary Consul of the Federal Republic of Germany in St. Lucia and a citizen of St. Lucia. On May 24, 2019, the Federal Republic of Germany bestowed on Karolin the Order of Merit to acknowledge her work as Honorary Consul and her volunteer leadership in St. Lucia and the Caribbean to promote sustainable operations, building resilience, and mitigating the effects of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Karolin Troubetzkoy.
Good morning. I didn't expect quite that introduction. Thank you. Protocol having been established by our Master of Ceremonies, let me just simply say welcome and thank you for being here with us this morning. I'm here in my capacity of Chairperson of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and we are indeed extremely pleased to partner with the CHEF Small Grants Program, and organize this event together as a joint effort. This allows us to showcase our work on the ground across the Caribbean and sharing with you some of the amazing initiatives that we have created in support of conservation of biodiversity whilst also improving livelihoods. In addition to the exhibition and knowledge fair, we look forward to fostering collaboration between our Caribbean partners and different entities and organizations here in Barbados. I'm also very happy to see here in person 5 of our 11 National Conservation Trust Funds, which receive support from the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund through what is the largest environmental endowment fund in our Conservation Finance Program, and that the other 6 National Conservation Trust Funds have joined us virtually. For those of you who don't know us very well, just to note that the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund was established in 2012 with the goal to ensure consistent funding for conservation and sustainable development in the Caribbean. The topic of this conference is therefore directly aligned with our own strategic priorities in terms of the design and the establishment of new regional thematic funding windows. We are very proud that Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has grown from an initial capital of $45 million for one program to almost $150 million today for our 3 programs and numerous additional initiatives. We are honored by the trust our donors have shown us and deeply appreciate our partnership with them, so please allow me a moment to acknowledge them. Our longest-standing partners are the Government of Germany, particularly through their German Development Bank, KfW as you would know it, the Nature Conservancy, the World Bank, and more recently the French Development Agency, the French Facility for Global Environment, the Blue Nature Alliance, and the Global Affairs Canada. We look forward to further expand this list, along with a growing list of ideas for innovation and sustainable financing. We are pleased, for example, to have the 2 leading countries working on debt swaps with us here today and tomorrow to share their experiences and exchange knowledge and learnings with other countries in the process. These countries are Belize and our hosts here in Barbados. Let me please also acknowledge the impressive work and drive of the Government of Barbados in the area of conservation, blue economy, and sustainable conservation financing. Minister Forde, the name of your ministry says it all. The environment, the green economy, and the blue economy are indeed critically important for all of our Caribbean nations. Barbados now also has the distinction of having established their own conservation trust fund. The Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has been a strong advocate for conservation trust funds, and we therefore welcome the Barbados Environmental Sustainability Fund, in short BESF, to the region. I see Gregory Hinkson right here. We have had previous chats. Very nice to see you and meet you in person finally. We look forward to working with your trust fund and have areas of common interest in development to go into. Finally, there are a number of CBF partners here in person with us today to contribute to the conference and the knowledge fair. These CBF partners are from the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund. I see Karen. Also the Belize Fund for a Sustainable Future, Grenada Sustainable Development Trust Fund, the National Conservation Trust Fund of Jamaica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines Conservation Trust Fund, and of course our very own, allow me an extra smile, St. Lucia National Conservation Trust Fund. And then there is also SPAWRAC, S-P-A-W-R-A-C. I'm not allowed to tell you what this is. Your homework will be to find out what that stands for. Without the commitment of our partners that I've just named, we would not have been able to achieve the excellent results that we could accomplish so far in our shared vision to safeguard, preserve, and enhance our Caribbean region to allow for our natural environments and our people to shine and to thrive. On that note, I thank you.
My distinct pleasure at this time to welcome my colleague, an amazing leader, a leader that leads not only brilliantly, but also with heart. And that's important. To give remarks on the behalf of UNDP, Barbados and Eastern Caribbean Multicultural Office, but this amazing, thoughtful leader, before she's welcomed to the podium, and I know she probably doesn't want this, but we're gonna give her a brief introduction via her bio. No, she doesn't want it, but Marcia, you go ahead. Thank you.
Ms. Limya Eltayeb, United Nations Development Program Resident Representative for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Limya's experience spans 27 years and 4 continents, with work on development and urban planning, local administration, social inclusion, human rights, and partnerships. Joining the United Nations Development Program Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean team as resident representative in 2022, she previously served the UNDP in Albania, Bahrain, Gambia, Partnerships New York, and Iraq. She worked in development and humanitarian settings in Sudan, Iraq, and with the Albanian earthquake. She enjoys working on blue economy, green growth, innovation, small, micro, medium enterprises value chains, and protection of the environment. Recently, she supported establishing the first sexual violence center, first marine protected area, and visits of presidents of European Commission and Croatia. Prior, Limya was director of the Agency for Cooperation and Research in Development, ACCORD, in Sudan, and one of the initiators of engendering the IGAD peace process. She's married, has one daughter, holds a bachelor's in architecture, master's in urban planning and development, and graduate certificates in social development. Ms. Limya Eltayeb.
Greetings, everyone. My team is so innovative, they never listen to me. Greetings, and let me welcome you again on behalf of the UNDP team, the Small Grants Program, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and the GEF. It is this sort of partnership that brings us together for this conversation that we're having today. A conversation on investments in biodiversity in the Caribbean, and how to go about it and what to do next. The Caribbean boasts incredible endowments and heritage. It boasts a unique biodiversity, a unique habitat, and a very unique ecosystem. An ecosystem that we sometimes take for granted. An ecosystem that we must protect today because of the challenges we face. The climate pressures, the economic pressures make it imperative and pivotal that we put biodiversity at the center of every conversation. And I think that is why we are all here today. That is why we wanted to come together in this conversation. As we are having a global conversation on financing climate change, as we are having a regional and sub-regional conversation on how to invest in the blue economy and green growth, we cannot have those two conversations without including biodiversity, conservation, habitat restoration, and how to protect ecosystems. It is pivotal that we make this a part of that discussion. It is pivotal that we make it at the center of every conversation, or else we are going to go back to the same ways that led us to where we are today. And for me, that is the basic central message that brings me to the podium today. It is that message alone. It is our responsibility. Oh, now I'm being recorded. I have to be more careful. It is our responsibility to make sure that we protect the biodiversity and the ecosystems, that we are the stewards, and that we leave them for future generations, not only to use them and benefit from them, but also to be able to invest in them and use them as a resource for future investments. That is the cycle of life. That is what we have to give to our children and the children of our children. We look at the Caribbean, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to stay still new. I've been here almost a year now, but I feel new. I'm learning every day, and what I learn every day is I see people with resilience, but I also see life and species with resilience. And that gives me hope, because it's this Caribbean communities, people, and species that get up after every hurricane and every storm, that rebuild and restore themselves. And I feel that it is our duty to help that resilience, to always be there in helping the restoration, and not to leave it to nature alone, not to leave it to coincidence, not to leave it as an afterthought, but for it to be part of our planning, right from the beginning. How do we make sure that these things go in parallel? I just came from Albania, and one of the things we did there, I was there for 5 years. In my first year, we launched 2 projects. And it was not by coincidence that they were launched at the same time. And I waited until I found the funding of those 2 projects. One was the Blue Economy Program for the Government of Albania, and the other was the protection of the ocean, which included both pollution, but also supporting the port authorities in how to deal with oil spills. That is how we need to move forward. It is important that the sub-region and region has blue economy programs. It is imperative that we have green industries and green growth. But we have to have a third bucket with those 2 that says biodiversity and the protection of habitats. They have to go hand in hand right from the beginning. We know that we have to invest in cruise lines, but cruise lines produce carbon. How do we make sure that we are at the same time addressing those issues? We know that we have to invest in the freight industry. How do we deal with the sediments? We know that fisheries is an important sector. How do we make sure that we are not overfishing? How do we make sure that there's no fish loss? Globally, for example, every year we lose 20 million tons of fish worldwide. Every single year. That is enough to feed 19 million people. How do we turn that around, and how do we recalculate our investments so that we are clear in understanding that investing in a better fisheries process is actually better value for money in the long run? How do we recalculate our investments so that we know what the natural cost is, what the habitat cost is, what the cost to our ecosystems and biodiversity is, and make sure that we are planning for that and investing in that from the beginning, in parallel. Yes, we invest in the freight, but we invest in the biodiversity fund in parallel and make sure that our projects are running in parallel. And that is the future that we aspire for. That is the future we are looking forward for, and this is the reason why we are all here today in this room. And I really hope that we can have conversations around that. We have to break down the barriers. There's no way to do that while thinking in sectoral ministries or agencies or UNDP versus the fund. No, it has to be a collaborative action. I think it was David that said a call for action, and Karolin that said partnerships. We need both. We need strong partnerships, a holistic vision that brings the pieces together. We also need inclusive strategies. How do we make sure that the communities and people who are most impacted by environmental degradation have a voice? Have a voice that is not only heard, but is also respected. And how can they be the first to gain from the projects and from the investments? That has to be part of the planning right from the beginning. It is voices like those of one of our project partners, Caitlin, and I'm going to read her quote. Caitlin is an 18-year-old from the Bahamas and one of our partners in a project we have to bring youth into the center of the conversation on marine biodiversity, teaching them the strategies, but also the consequences of not doing it. Caitlin said, "What motivates my friends and me to protect nature is sustaining it for future generations. Nature is often neglected by human beings and human action in today's world, and now its survival is becoming a vital part and aspect of life. We have to protect it." This is one of the projects that we have in UNDP Another one is in St. Vincent, where we're helping to protect the St. Vincent parrot. I'm not going to try to put in the endemic name and the scientific name. There are too many scientists in the room. Another thing I'm very proud of, even though it's a small initiative, restoring that habitat, especially after the volcanic eruption, for them to come back to their natural habitat and to flourish and grow. This is an endowment for the country and the people in those communities, an endowment that we have to preserve and restore for the future. Another initiative that we are kicking off with our partners in Canada is on water security and biodiversity resilience, an understanding that you cannot tackle the issues of water without understanding biodiversity and its impact and how it affects the communities there and how to restore ecosystems and the biodiversity in those waters. These things go in hand. The days when we would just have water projects alone are gone. The days when we would have economic investments alone are gone. The days when we would talk about political voices without understanding that communities have a say and that they want to protect those communities and their future for their generations as part of that political dialogue are gone. And I hope that we can move together into a new future. So today, I'm asking you that in the next 2 days, we have a conversation about leveraging the private sector investments. We have a conversation about public-private partnerships. We have a conversation about economic incentives for conservation, protection, and biodiversity. We have a conversation about blended financing that includes not only economic gains, but also natural and planet gains, gains for planet and people. We have a conversation of how future new industries that we are embarking on also include protecting biodiversity. I know that we're up for the task. I know that those who are here today for the opening, but many others that are going to be here in the sessions coming for the actual in-depth experts conversations are up for that and committed to that. That's why we are here together. I want to thank our partners, the Carbon Biodiversity Fund, the Small Grants Program, the GEF, and I want to reconfirm that UNDP and I are firmly behind this initiative, and we will do everything in Empower to support each other and continue this partnership for real action, not just for the dialogue, to take it one step further. With that, I thank you and wish you fantastic deliberations. Thank you.
Now, it's my pleasure at this point to introduce a giant that walks among men. So Trevor Carmichael, who's going to give us the keynote address.
I must thank UNDP, Dr. David, and Limya as well, Dr. Limya, for having taken a chance with me here. But essentially, I have to thank them for hosting this very timely symposium. It's a timely symposium with a very well-selected group of participants. And I remain humbled to be asked to give a keynote address. Such an address generally seeks to highlight some issue or issues which are current and germane to the discussions around the symposium, and to offer some views or a perspective on these issues. This morning, my point of departure is the financing of our numerous and collective efforts towards an ideal and optimal biodiversity. Essentially, the approach which I choose to take this morning is to explore biodiversity financing at two levels of analysis, namely the macro financing, or the higher level, governments, regional organizations, and development institutions. And such financing is often driven by institutional mechanisms borrowed by the found in the world of financial and finance and tailored to suit the needs of environmental resilience and the like. I also propose to say a few words at the level of analysis to protect. I think I'm going to get some water here. I was a little late for this morning's proceedings because I actually I actually had a bit of a physical challenge, and but I said I would still come and attempt to give some remarks. But we could talk. Yeah. Yeah. You know, I said that if we look at it at the global level, we see the increase in global debt. We see the impact of COVID on developing country debt, and how it's already reached a stage that's totaling at least 5 trillion by the end of 2019. We see the great increases in debt coming from rising private sector debt. We see on average in 2018 developing countries spending more than 10% of their resources on debt servicing. And what has happened is that the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in increasing borrowing for national health and welfare spending, and downturns also in economic activity, shocks and disruptions to the global financial market. And what this has done is that it has increased significantly the size of developing countries' debt, as well as it has also, in a sense, depolarized investments in addressing climate change and preventing nature loss. So what we have is therefore a climate emergency. We have the impacts of climate change exposing and rendering social systems vulnerable to shocks. We have climate change impacting and threatening to undermine the development efforts and increase poverty in vulnerable countries. We see low and middle income countries on the front line of climate change impacting and are not able to respond and recover from climate measures. All of these are the elements of the climate emergency. And enter debt for climate swaps, no longer debt for nature, but debt for climate swaps. And what is interesting is that the potential beneficiaries of post-COVID-19 debt and the beneficiaries of debt for nature swaps fit into 3 natural categories: the ministries of finance and the banks, central banks, that is obviously in developing countries. On the one hand, we see the creditors on the other hand providing new securities and new financing. And we see conservation organizations, the conservation organizations of which we are all a part. So there are these natural elements that are present in the arrangements that take place after the COVID-19. You know, what are one of the interesting aspects of what I call the recent arrangements or the new arrangements is that a lot of the institutional banks and players, institutional financial institutions, are playing a heightened role and a heightened interest. And there are obvious reasons, not only the social good which they are able to impart, but also there's a good financing model for actively participating. One of them is Morgan Stanley. And I have tracked what they've been doing very closely. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear that the area that they have decided to focus on is actually the blue economy. They have said, and they have suggested, they have looked at that, they have recognized that the blue economy already has attracted other diverse investors with assets in venture capital, public equity, and also in fixed incomes. Venture capital firms and other early stage investors are especially active in the circular economy. We know that. And they're showing that interest. In the fund income space, blue bonds are beginning to be arranged and to emerge and to fund sustainable ocean projects. Morgan Stanley, again, I come back to them, has worked with the Export-Import Bank of Korea in a 3.5 billion bond launch in 2022. And in that was included a 1 billion blue tranche for sustainable marine transportation. So you see there's a recognition going on here. But we also see in this new dispensation marine solutions to protect ecosystems. As sea levels rise, coastal communities will need ways to protect critical infrastructures such as roads and homes. Marine nature-based solutions such as seagrass beds, mangroves, and and also salt marshes are proven to protect coastal communities. And the analysis tells us that $1.1 trillion in investments will take place in that specific area between 2022 and 2050. So that is an area which is ripe for investment and where the players will come together over those years and put that money which is needed. And this is based on the analysis which has taken place, the amounts that are needed. Also in the area of marine renewable energy, oceans obviously can unlock more opportunities to facilitate the global transition to clean energy, fixed offshore wind farms in shallow coastal areas. And that is possibly currently the largest marine-based source of energy, of clean energy. But there are other technologies which are also emerging, such as floating offshore wind turbines in deeper waters. And there are also other tools to harness the wave and tidal energy. And by 2040, they tell us that global offshore wind sites could meet projected markets demand for almost all global electricity needs. But to move toward a clean energy economy, wind farm construction will require $840 billion in capital expenditures. So there again, this is another big area where once the parameters are set and put together, I should say, funding will emerge, partnerships will be formed, and the like. And then there's sustainable aquaculture. Approximately half of the global seafood production today, we know, comes from farmed resources or aquaculture, mostly in Asia. The other half comes from wild fish stocks, which we're facing pressure from overfishing as global seafood demand continues to grow. So expanding aquaculture to meet this demand is a major investment opportunity with an estimated 150 to 300 billion in capital expenditure, which is expected and needed to expand capacity in the next 10 years. So this is another big opportunity which will present itself in a broad sense. Now, I said that I would pitch my analysis at two levels of analysis. Speaking about these opportunities, these big opportunities, which some of us will be a part of them. We'll just, but we will tap into them one way or another in terms of development institutions. But then there's another level of analysis, which is in terms of us here as non-governmental nonprofits. And I always mention that the first Debt for Nature swap in Barbados actually took place, it's never recorded, but took place in the 1980s. It took place in the 1980s when my very good friend, Mr. Bruce Zagaris, a Washington lawyer, and I put together a scheme, I should say, whereby an American owner of property in Barbados was able to structure his financial affairs in such a way that he could donate a property here in Barbados to the Barbados Museum and get certain tax benefits to bring his tax situation in the US to virtually zero. Now, this story doesn't end here. And this is a property at Deebles Point in St. Philip, which is on the southeastern part of Barbados. And that property was given to the museum. And the museum has kept it for many years. And now the museum is in negotiations with an environmental company which is seeking to put up a solar farm of a specialized nature at Deeples Point. So the museum will be getting revenue from that. But even before this revenue comes, the museum has been able to put this property on its books as part of the capital assets of the institution. So this was the first debt for nature swap to have taken place. That's what it was. And it manifests itself even now. But the importance of this is that our NGOs or nonprofits can continue to contribute to the biodiversity in terms of what they do physically, in the simple acts, but also in their donations. Indeed, the second gift that the museum was able to get was a different Trevor diversity, but the enslaved burial ground at Newton Plantation, which was also a gift back in the 90s, but which has not been developed, but now, as the only such archaeological relic in the world, will now be developed internationally. So again, this shows another element of fundraising and of raising capital, where a particular gift can be given to the institution, and the institution can then broaden its scope, as indeed the Newton enslaved ground will now be a national as well as an international site of its kind, representing one of its kind. And this is very useful. But where giving expands and becomes even more, it can be seen by yet another non-profit here. Another one with which fortunately I'm associated as well. The Barbados National Trust. And the Barbados National Trust received a gift of Andromeda Gardens. Andromeda Gardens from a member of the trust, I happen to be the person who drew up her will and whom she convinced, because I was president of the trust at the time, that we should take the property. I also am the person who happened to go to the courts when the gift was not challenged, but the will was sought to be interpreted. That was the way it was put. And I didn't fear a conflict of interest, so I went happily. But I say all that to suggest that this entity, this beautiful piece of Barbados' biodiversity, is a fundraiser for the Barbados National Trust as a result of a gift. So it's put no initial capital expenditure, it's received a gift. And it's received a gift from an ex-member of the trust. If you go to the trust headquarters, Wildy House, also another gift by another member. And that is where the trust is able to do its, to carry out its programs. These programs which add to our biodiversity, a gift. The thread I'm trying to wheel here is that these gifts are not merely things that are handed to an institution, and the institution goes to flag raising or some ceremony and says thank you. And, we say, what a lovely thing. No, these gifts are developmental in terms of the work that is carried on and in terms for nonprofits, how they add to the biodiversity. So I look at Coral, and I see Ms. Susan Mahan is here and will represent Coral very well, of which again I'm very pleased to have been asked to be trustee emeritus for Coral. But Coral has been a major recipient of the small grants program of the UNDP, and I say thank you both to, and to you, David, and to you, Limya. You have done us well because you've given us the small grant and it's been well used. And Coral is today the largest, I would say, volunteer-driven nonprofit in Barbados. And on a per capita basis, has received the highest amount of funds from its members. Not a lot. Not a lot if you look at it, but in terms of the fact that it's volunteer driven and it's received these funds, you can appreciate how effective Coral is working towards protecting this biodiversity. And that is why, and I don't have to say about this, I know later in the program, Susan Mahan will be able to speak about Coral, and she runs it. It's hers. Let her speak about it. I only say this to strengthen my point, if you will. My earlier point was looking at these large sums of money which can be invested, and which will be invested over the next 20 to 30 years. It sounds almost magical and almost out of the thought, but it will happen. But now I came to the other level of analysis to show how, in the case of 3 nonprofits, one very current, Coral, the other 2, one celebrating 90 years and the other 40 years, but how and all could engage in the biodiversity, but how their gifts, what look as mere gifts, become a big part and parcel of the biodiversity that we all seek to protect here this morning, tomorrow, and always. I wrote a little ending here because I thought it might be funny. It may not be funny, but I wrote it, and I'm just going to read it out. I wrote it this morning. I said, as I bring these not so random thoughts to a close, I am reminded of an interesting article in this month's Garden magazine of the Royal Horticultural Society, and it's entitled "The Lonely but Essential Lives of Solitary Wasps." The wasp, W-A-S-P-S. I encourage us to learn to love the wasp and the important benefit which it gives to gardens, hunting insects, and generally fighting greenhouse pests. No, the wasp was pioneered at the Royal Horticultural Society's garden at Wisley by a Dr. Andrew Salisbury. And this happened a century ago. And the method still remains useful today, the method of training the wasp. In essence, I suggest, the biodiversity protected by the wasps may well be extrapolated on a larger scale to the efforts we employ to protect our local, regional, and global biodiversity. I am sure that our deliberations during this symposium will add significant value to the cause, even in the absence of WASPs. Thank you.
Pleasant good morning to one and all. Protocols are already established. Sir Trevor, it would take a human effort for me to be able to follow on from you, but I will try my best. David, thank you, of course, Dr. David, for your glowing tribute. But I want to start with a disclaimer. That is me there. Wait, go on. Previously, that was me, a couple of years ago. Right. We have a serious conversation here before us. And I came up with an axiom, and I want to admit it didn't drop off out the sky like something from a Chicken Licken episode. But it was a serious axiom that I came up with. And it goes like this: life on this earth began with biodiversity. It will end with the loss of biodiversity. Very simple, but very real, because that is what we are faced with. We are faced with ecocide if we do not put our visual acuity firmly scoped on biodiversity and its conservation, its protection. And the world over is faced with a triple planetary crisis: pollution, climate change, biodiversity loss. We now must collectively put our efforts to ensure that this world is able to survive the test of times for not only ourselves, but for our children and our children's children. That is the reality that we are faced with. Since the industrial era, we have lost over 800,000 species of animals, over 800,000. Over 600,000 species of plants. Over 1 million insects and insect species are threatened as I speak. These are devastating facts. These are facts that will influence our basic ability to survive. But what can we do? And how do we influence a change as it relates to these damning figures that we are faced with? What we do, or what we can do, is really up to us collectively. It is up to us as a small island development state group to say to the rest of the world that although we live in the tropics, 2 billion people, and although we produce, in terms of greenhouse gas and the contribution to the global warming, very little, we feel the full effects, the adverse effects of climate change. We feel the adverse effects of biodiversity loss. We feel the adverse effects of deforestation, again because of the global warming. So we as a small island state, Barbados as I speak, we contribute only 2 million tons of carbon dioxide in the whole scheme of the world, which produces about 40 billion tons or so. Probably this year we'll produce more. Yet still, only last week we found out that the vagaries and idiosyncrasies associated with climate change could find itself on our doorstep with the threat of Hurricane Bert. This is the reality that we, as a small island development state, is faced with. And as I said, although we produce only so little, we have to be faced with the brunt effect of these vagaries. I want to thank my team in the ministry for leading the charge at our last COP15, when the global community was able to recognize that the small island developing states, as we know them, must have a voice in the space, and that we must be able to have access to much needed finances if we are going to put measures in place, if we are going to have that resilience. And resilience is basically a combination of mitigation and adaptation. If we are supposed to mitigate the challenges and adapt to them, then we have to be able to have the finance mechanisms. And finance for us must not be a misnomer. It must be real. So we agitated, and the global community listened, probably for once. It was that once in a lifetime moment when the tidal wave of change would rise up. And that's why I said I want to thank my technical people for agitating on behalf of not only Barbados, but collectively the small island developing states, where we say that unless we have an equal space, unless there is the financial net where those billions of dollars normally go to other countries, and small island developing states, unfortunately, are left by the wayside. That unless that we start recognizing that we are the most vulnerable, unless there's recognition to the fact that there's a rich oasis of biodiversity in not only Caribbean, but by extension the entire tropics. That unless the world understands this, then the devastating effects for us as a people will see the complete destruction of the Western Hemisphere. Unfortunately, they took note. So coming out of that meeting, we had about 4 goals and 23 mission statements to go along with it, to say these are the priorities. This is how the global community will respond to the needs of small island developing states. I want to say before that, Barbados was able to have a national strategic action plan passed in the Parliament. I can't remember if it was sometime in November. It was November 2022. I was the person who led the charge. But an action plan that said to the rest of the world, we have 12 target areas, and we are going to achieve those target areas, where we will definitely realize 70% or so biodiversity on land. Remember, of course, that part of our Sustainable Development Goal 15 is life as it relates to the land. But equally, Sustainable Development Goal 14, which is life on the water, because we said as well, at least 30% of our biodiversity under the ocean, or in the ocean, will be realized as well by 2030, making it the 2030 vision that we so glowingly speak about. But to have that 2030 vision is not because Barbados acquiesced to the United Nations General Assembly call. For us, it is a Bayesian call. It is a national call, a national effort. And that's why those 12 target areas, those 12 decision and strategy areas that we are focusing on, speaks from communication right down to empowering the indigenous folk to be able to be part and to have a tangible association with the improvement of biodiversity, the conservation and preservation. It is real what we are faced with. And like we said, and you know, Sir Trevor alluded to the first net financial swap that he was a part of. But government only recently approved, of course, and got the blessings for a debt financial swap with our partners TNC, which is Nature Conservancy, and IDB. I see my good friend here. To be able to say to the rest of the world, we are going to have our first marine spatial plan, a plan that seeks to demarcate the ocean in a special way. But the first thing we are going to look at, and as a part of the full ventilation of that plan, is the medium potential biodiversity. To be able to say this is an area within the next 5 years that we are going to focus on with our definition swap to enhance our biodiversity, because we understand the importance of biodiversity as it relates to the preservation of life. That is what we said. And I want to say that that plan has started already. There were initial meetings, and we are well on our way to ensure that over the next couple of years that we are able to preserve our biodiversity. We have also philosophically understand and appreciate the biological diversity beyond our national jurisdiction. We have said to the international community that Barbados recognize, like others, that at least 90% of the ocean or more is unclaimed. But in that unclaimed ocean, there is a rich oasis of biodiversity that must not be destroyed but preserved. And it's for the world over to appreciate and understand this, that biodiversity beyond our borders must also be part of our visual scope. And we must be able to say to the rest of the world, this is a part of our intellectual property, and we will do our best to preserve it, preserve our seabed, ensure that there is nothing that will destroy that natural oasis. That is what we have said. So I am happy to be part of the conversation and to say to you, we cannot do it unless we have the financial wherewithal, unless that there is the ability for us to say to our people, our indigenous people, our people generally, this is how we do it, and this is what we can do to be part of something that will save your life. Because partnerships, and I think Dr. Bino you spoke to earlier, partnerships are active, and it must be part of the conversation. There are 5 P's, or 5 planks as we call it, that associate itself with sustainable development. 1, the planet. We know the threats of the planet. The next one is prosperity. It is every single leader's dream to have a country that can prosper, a people that can prosper. Next one is peace. How can we have peace? A peaceful place where persons understand that they can balance their humors in a natural way. Peace. Partnership. Important cog. You must be able to imbue persons with a sense of ownership of any program or project that they're involved in. And biodiversity is one of those. We must be able to walk persons in the journey of understanding what they're fighting for. I am saying today that this conversation is very important. It will basically save lives. So over the next couple of hours, as you put your collective sinew together, looking at the innovative means of and creative solutions for the problems associated with and challenges of financing, I want you to remember one thing. Your work here today will save lives. Ecocide is real. Land degradation is real. This soil as we know it, if we continue on our current trajectory, will be no more. We predict within the next 60 years or so, at least 12 inches of the soil will no longer be viable. It will devastate our agricultural industry. Needless to say, our biodiversity. This is real. And so, your work is real. It is therefore, for us as a government and us as a country, to say, now, right now is the right time to do the right thing. So let us continue with unbridled energy and sweat expenditure to ensure that we allow not only the survival of our people, but the survival of our planet. Ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful session. Thank you.
Vision of your government when you took office on May 28th, 2018. I would probably give you the exact time, but I didn't really keep a record of that one. But May 24th, 2018. Having taken office and being greeted with a large debt burden, one of the early agenda items that would have been identified would be mechanisms like the debt for nature swap to assist in the reduction and management of foreign debt in particular. Now, at this early stage, we would like to understand what would have led the Government of Barbados to turn to debt for nature swaps in the way that you did, because it was something that we can see that you aggressively pursued. What were the potential perceived benefits of such a swap in addressing both the environmental conservation, social inclusion, and economic debt relief policy spearheaded by the Prime Minister, of course?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, David. Good morning, everyone. I think I will first state that when we came to office 5 years ago, we undertook a very serious review as to exactly how we were spending the money that we were collecting. And in that context, we recognized that given the priorities then, that we needed to recalibrate and focus on what we could deliver in the short, medium, and certainly the long term. Now, nobody likes to discuss debt restructuring because that means that you're not going to get what was originally set out. I must say, David, that because I saw some young people here, so it's important for us to appreciate that taxation is important for how you manage not just the delivery of public service, but certainly the accumulation of debt over time and how that's financed. It's very important to understand the very delicate balance of that. So we needed to bring some order back to exactly how we were spending the money so that the citizens will feel a sense of reconnect with the quality of the public services that they were seeing, with what they were paying, and therefore we needed to have a very, very, very aggressive approach to addressing the fiscal discipline that was required to maintain the trust with the people. Now, we determined that we were going to have a new public finance management bill, and I'm going to just bring to your attention very quickly Clause 38, which sets out through policy how we would prioritize environmental sustainability as part of how government would manage its public finances. So we established that very broad principle there, such that when we contemplated doing the debt restructuring, that we understood that we needed to do that to improve the services that the public was being offered. Now, as with most debt distress situations, normally when you complete a debt restructuring, your bonds typically would trade at a discount. So you normally would have to buy or sell, depending on how your perspective, at maybe 75 cents on the dollar, 72 cents on the dollar, in that range. Because people want to get rid of the debt that they're holding in order to recover as quickly as possible. We did not have that experience. We had the opposite experience because we completed our domestic debt restructuring within 4 months. By the September of 2018, we completed the external debt restructuring within 18 months, still relatively short compared to international standards. And so by that time, when we had concluded the external debt, our debt continued to trade at 100, 101, 102, meaning that we could not contemplate the traditional buyback to do the debt finance, which is what we were planning to do, to divert resources into the space. So Minister Humphrey, who was then the Minister of Maritime Affairs and Blue Economy, kept saying to me, "Well, Minister, where we can get the money from?" Because obviously we were banking on what was a traditional type of approach to conceiving of this reallocation of resources to deal with marine conservation, biodiversity, and the like. Now, I say all of that to say that we had wonderful support from the IDB, and I see my colleagues here from the IDB, in coming up with a mechanism that allowed us to mimic, if you like, that discounting process by providing a guarantee to stand in the middle to create that space, as well as TNC coming to the table to be able to do that. And therefore, in serving as a template for how countries could reallocate existing expenditure over the next 15 years to focus on marine conservation and biodiversity efforts, I think is going to be huge with respect to how the government would not ordinarily have resources available to do that. So even though we've had tremendous support over the years from the IDB in a number of environmental projects right along the coastline of Barbados, historically, we really need to accelerate that, and therefore debt financial swaps can serve as a tool through which that could be done. Just very quickly, so we established out of that relationship the Barbados Environmental Sustainability Fund. So the government sits on it along with TNC, along with the University of West Indies, tripartite type body, so that those funds that will be diverted into from the debt savings into about $50 million US over the next 15 years into that fund will divert those resources specifically to respond to the areas that have been identified as part of the mechanism. Now, the reason that is equally important is because being an ocean state, we are a small island, but a large ocean state, and I think we need to understand what that means, and therefore having an opportunity for young people to participate actively in the idea of a bioeconomy, a true bioeconomy, on land as well as on in the marine space, is going to be important for unlocking sustainable businesses, I think, moving forward, and obviously ensuring that we can maintain the balance between leisure, economic opportunity, as well as unlocking, I think, areas of innovation that I think young people really can support. So, whilst it's important to remember, though, that the taxes still have to be paid in order for those monies to go into the fund. So I don't want to be the bearer of bad news on that front, but having committed to a level of debt service for 15 years, then it means that in order for the government to deliver those funds into the BESF, then obviously it means ordinary citizens have to continue to do what they're doing, which means that the government has to live up to what those expectations are for the quality of public services being offered, such that that promise under that structure that we have conceived to facilitate funding these very important activities, that citizens understand that it's not just a tax matter. This is really not about how do we balance maintaining and improving, if you like, the environmental and marine life and the situation that's there now, and ensuring then that my colleagues here to my left, who are the ones really out there doing this work, this very, very, very important work, that they have the resources to be able to do that. And let me just say that not only in relation to what we are doing, in the budget of this year, we agreed that we would unlock additional resources that will go into the fund. Any unclaimed assets at the central bank or in the system, 50% of those will go into the fund, and we're going to unlock even more resources that others can crowd in to the space to accelerate work in this space. So this is an important part of how we've created this little space to provide resources over 15 years, but we want to supersize that by having more resources brought in as quickly as possible.
Excellent, excellent. Now I see why you wanted the young people to be in the room, because they have to pay the taxes. But seriously, you mentioned being a template. And that template is extremely important, because it's not only us in the room, there are persons online, there are persons listening to this in Latin America and as far as Africa. And therefore, we would want them to benefit from your experience, which is rich. So therefore, with hindsight, Minister Strawn, what are some of the specific challenges and opportunities that you would identify during the whole process of creation, negotiation, and the development of the Debt for Nature swap that you would like to share?
Well, I think the one thing that we should bear in mind is that this came about mainly because the debt was considered unsustainable. We don't want our debt to become unsustainable in order to come up with these creative ideas. And so I think it's important for us to appreciate that whilst we are working with our partners to see how we can do instruments like these to mobilize additional resources into the space, especially some private capital, that we want to be able to not lose sight of the fact that this effort came about because we were under debt distress. Under normal circumstances, such opportunities would not ordinarily exist, unless, of course, there's a very specific instrument being introduced to be able to do that. Let me just say that I hope there are no lawyers in the room or online, but so Trevor, yes. But no, I say that from the perspective that in dealing with 5 sets of lawyers, because the government has its own lawyers to execute this specific thing. We had to deal with IDB's lawyers, TNC's lawyers, CIBC's lawyers, Credit Suisse's lawyers.
Wow.
Getting the legal persons on board early is important to assure that execution can happen quickly. And I want to thank certainly the partners for understanding that, because the timelines that we were up against to get these things done, dealing with. So
give us an idea of some of the timelines as you.
Well, you want to negotiate and make sure you can launch and get the perfect the timing is important given the market conditions. So that's important to understand as well.
Excellent point.
Because let me just make the point here. As we were contemplating doing this swap, our debt was still trading at par, 101, 100, and 100 all the time. Only when the war started last year did we see the debt start to trade below par. So all that time we were trying to make sure that the conditions remain right for execution of the thing, because it meant that when we put it into the marketplace, that people would want to purchase it and be a part of it. And I'm happy to say that we were able to complete it in a timely fashion, such that even though we bought approximately 75 million of the external debt, as well as 75 million US from the part that the NAS, the local NAS was holding, because it was the most expensive part of the debt. So we were able to achieve that 50 million in savings from proper liability management. That's a financial part, I hope, which we'll leave for the moment. But subsequent to that, what we saw was that the loan actually received an award as an innovative loan, because one, it has natural disaster clauses included. It also has a pandemic clause included. It's the only instrument in the world that has both natural disaster and pandemic clause. So it won an international award for an innovative instrument, such that the largest teachers' pension fund in the United States, then subsequently, as part of their ESG commitments for investing, bought 80% of it on the secondary market, because it was innovative in its own right, and it allowed us then to be able to then unlock more resources to be able to do that. So really and truly, doing these things with the right partners can lead to other benefits, and therefore it's something that we feel if we can work collaboratively with partners of the IDB and TNC and the private sector, that we can bring a blended financing mechanism to be able to unlock even more resources for this very important area of marine conservation and maintaining the biodiversity that's there. Perfect. So get the lawyers on board early. The timing. Is important, and as we speak now, we are contemplating doing not a definition swap, but a debt for climate swap, because the market conditions are right again. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. But timing is important. The market conditions are important for execution.
Now you mentioned something very important. So you don't want to do it, because when conditions are not right, and you don't want to be in a situation where your debt is unsustainable. But there's some other components of this swap that you mentioned. I remember speaking to Professor Abbas Prasad, and we talked about the same clauses that you mentioned earlier. But there is a bond. Is there a bond component as a part of this as well that allows you to be able to get private involvement in the actual debt for nature swap? And this is something I want to get to, because the private sector was very much involved in this, which is unique. There are only few debt for nature swaps globally, probably only 3 where the private sector got actively involved the way how it did here. Because debt for nature swaps are really nothing new. Since the late 1980s, we saw many of them. But these early deals typically involve, creditors writing off debt bilaterally, so long as the savings were channeled into conservation. And there were, we can call them grants in a sense. 2 things stand out about this deal and the deal in Belize. First, the bond market itself got involved. They provided the grant in the form of a discounted price, right? Second, the deal involved debt owned to private creditors and was in the end financed by a different class of private investors. So we saw that in Belize. It also showed that the potential for deals with countries that are experiencing economic difficulties and have expensive debt on their books, that is a real option. So these are some things that are unique about what happened in this context. But if we face reality, any debt for nature swap is complex, with varying circumstances that add to the complexity. You heard some of them just now from Minister Strong. Therefore, the priorities, the design, the circumstances, government buy-in, long-term commitment, negotiation, partners, the debt structure, all of these different factors really show that a single approach is really not applicable, right? So given this context, Minister Strong, how did you and your team successfully navigate some of these challenges? because it may look simple, it may look as though it was an easy road, but I'm sure from the conversation prior, it was not. So how do you negotiate that path? How did you and your team do it?
Well, so there are two elements. There's the financing side and then there are the deliverables. So my role was to make sure we could deliver the financing, and we established, as part of the structure, we established the sustainability linked bond framework, which in a sense will say, with the issuance of this blue bond, blue loan, blue bond, we will deliver on these specific milestones within the environmental space such that the relief is justified on the basis of the agreement that we set up. And it was important to recognize that certainly the Ministry of Environment and Blue Economy at the time, they were the ones who negotiated directly with TNC and other stakeholders on those very specific deliverables that the country will do with the resources over the next 15 years, and what the government will support. And therefore, those things, obviously, the scientists, obviously, and the persons with the know-how had significant input in terms of exactly what it is that the country could deliver. And in a sense, once I know they've started to look at the marine spatial planning already, which has been launched. Coastal Zone is intimately involved in relation to that. And the reality is that with those resources now being unlocked, it is the onus now is on us, government, working with the partners to ensure then that these things are agreed. And therefore, given the extensive consultation that has already taken place with a lot of the stakeholders, including the fisher folk, we are confident that we will be able to deliver on what that was signed. Now, just bear in mind that a lot of the consultation had taken place prior to COVID. And so when we were executing it, we had to be very clear and conscious that yes, we had some type of agreement before, but given the impact of COVID, we needed to revisit just very carefully to make sure that any lasting impact of COVID would not necessarily negatively impact on our capacity to deliver. And therefore, we needed to take that into consideration. So I think we were able to reach a happy medium, not necessarily on the financial side, because I think that was the numbers there were solid enough given the market conditions, and that interest rate has started to tick up. It's almost like the perfect set of C conditions, if you like, to do the swap. But on what the impact would have then within the stakeholders in the marine space, we relied heavily on the Ministry of Environment and those personnel to inform on those very specific things that we would agree to within the timeline, given all that had taken place. But it is by no means at all an easy path to agreeing what you will deliver, because with the science changing, the climate is changing, the conditions are changing, and therefore you got to bear in mind that in the execution of any research effort that is undertaken, that you can only follow where the science will take you in the end. But there's a built-in mechanism, obviously, to make sure that whatever is observed scientifically, that you will make whatever adjustments you need to make in order to still meet the overall objectives of the swap, but bearing in mind that as conditions change, then you have to be able to have a built-in mechanism for that. So we believe you're confident that with the partners, that structure is in place, but the overall tenets of what we are to deliver with respect to biodiversity protection and the areas, well, where to protect, that's where all of the science will come in, but we've given some commitments to say that there will be some minimum level of biodiversity protection built into the process. It's just a matter of where that will be done. But I'm conscious that you have me talking a lot, and my colleagues.
We're moving in the right direction because you said it has to be repaid. And this panel is kind of dominated by economists. You have economists here, you have an environmental economist here, another environmental economist here. And nowadays, every economist has to be an environmental economist because the type of world that we're living in, you can't get away from it. But Dr. Barry Bogue, as an environmental economist and a member of the Sustainability Unit at the Caribbean Development Bank, what are some of the key considerations that should be accounted for during this whole process, during the process of creation, development, negotiation of the debt financial swap, and the potential blue or green bonds that could be associated with it to ensure that not only that you meet the sustainability goals, but as you said, debt has to be repaid, that the debt created can be repaid?
Thank you, David. That's a
You're
very,
welcome.
very detailed question. Well, first of all, thanks to everyone here and the panel that is contributing to the discussion. I'm very pleased to be here to be part of the panel. Some of the things, I mean, if I had to prioritize 3 things that I would suggest in terms of what are some of the considerations. The first one, and this is taking up the environmental economics hat, but the first one would be having a conservation program and investing in a conservation program that is a long-term one, that spans beyond 5 years, that allows us to take those real development perspectives in place, and making sure that we design that properly. The second consideration would be the choice of institutions. So, for example, having a very strong local capacity, local NGO, as well as obviously partnering with the right development banks, the right commercial banks, and the government is very important to keep that institutional knowledge and capacity strong and built so that we can see the end of this swap that allows us to have gains from it as a country. And the third point, putting on the environmental economics hat, is of course that we need to have the exact value of those resources that we're swapping. If we underprice, it means that we underfund. And as a region, we can't afford to do that. So we know about the paucity of data in this region in terms of environmental estimates. And one of the things that you see happening is that you see the shifting around of gross estimates. And the utilization of it from different regions of the world. And at the end of the day, we need to be able to value our resources because the cost of our sargassum is not the same as in the Pacific Ocean. It's very different. So we, as a region, need to be able to hold on to those estimates, make a commitment to capturing those estimates and utilizing it when the negotiations come to our shores for our benefit. And I think that's one of the main cautions I see as we look forward and as we continue with that financial swaps. And clearly, it's going to become a financial tool that we're going to continuously use. But we need to make sure that we're valuing that properly.
This is some excellent points. Now, I know that this may be something Mr. Strong may also want to add to, but when we look at the size that you have 50 million in all that you have allocated for this, right? Mm-hmm. Relatively, to sustain something like this, when you look at admin costs and other things, and I remember speaking to Professor Prasad, and we were discussing that the size is very important, and Barbados coming in at 50 million may be a bit on the lower side that you may want for such a swap like this, right? So, I don't know, Nisha, what's your view on the debt financial swaps, and when you're utilizing blue bonds in particular? Do you think that there is like a ideal size when you look at the context of the type of development that we have to do in Barbados and the costs, not Barbados but the region itself, right? Would you recommend using more valuation tools to make a stronger argument for a larger size when you're looking at structuring these deals?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. We need to use more robust methodology to be able to value our resources. What we do now is we use meta-analyses because we don't have that initial data. And I'm pretty sure that leads us to underpricing it and undervaluing it, and therefore we're losing out on these negotiations.
I want to stop there, and I want the audience to listen to this carefully. She's saying you're doing a meta-analysis, right? Which means you're taking data from other places and you're imposing it on our conditions. There are a whole set of errors you can get when you're doing that. So why are we not able to do our valuations for ourselves?
We can. We need to have a commitment at the...
Commitment of what?
Commitment of those resources.
Excellent.
We need to have a focus at the University of the West Indies to have and develop those programs, those environmental economics programs. We have economists, we have students who go away and they don't come back to the region because it's not an area that is, you can get a job in, there's research. And so to underpin all of these discussions in the environment and conservation, you need to be able to value it. And that's not something that we're doing. In fact, we're 10, 15 years behind where we should be in terms of valuation.
And see, we have to make these conversations very real, because they're real conversations. Mm-hmm. I know Barbados recently had an agreement with the IMF where you have to do environmental accounting in terms of your balance sheet. So it's not just about your development, but you're looking at your development in the context of the environmental impact it had, right? And in doing so, you're going to need particular expertise to do that. And so financing and using these trust funds that we're developing has to look at developing the ecosystem to support such. And that's an important point that I think we should appreciate. But moving on to civil society, because civil society has an extremely important role to play. They advocate for the establishment, they look at the whole process of the negotiation, they're actively involved in monitoring evaluation. And overall, they can ensure that the whole process is transparent, that is participatory, it's aligned to the needs and aspirations of local communities because they're on the ground, right? So Dr. Peter, over to you. How can civil society organizations effectively engage local communities in design and implementation of such swaps to ensure that there is, a meaningful participation, but not only participation, but that they benefit?
Thank you very much, David.
You're
thank
most welcome.
you for including me on the panel. I will never pretend to be operating within the financial sphere. So really happy that the minister is here, my colleague to my left. I need to add that I came out of academia. It was mentioned that I have been teaching for 30-something years. And I came out of what I refer to as rigid academia because I recognized the importance of getting into the community, getting into forming partnerships and letting our stakeholders be active participants. I really am excited to hear about this opportunity in terms of swapping debt for nature. Because we are, as has been mentioned today, in a precarious position. Small island developing states, COVID did not do us well. Being not an economist, I did some homework, recognizing that COVID has increased the total debt for servicing, especially within small island states. And there's some that are servicing at levels over 50%, which is unacceptable. So this opportunity to then look internally with the proper mechanisms, as eloquently outlined by our minister, is a great opportunity. So how do we go into the communities? For me, I found that we have been talking to our stakeholders on the ground and not engaging them. We tell them about, the impacts of climate change. We tell them about the impacts of biodiversity loss, but we're really not engaging them. And that is the platform on which I function. I think that it's important to take science to our people. And as the minister indicated, the scientists will inform the mechanisms as to how, it can be executed on the ground. But I think when we go into the communities, we find out where the important targets are. And for me, I want to stand on the platform of plant biodiversity. I know we're hearing a lot about the blue bonds, etc. But I think that conservation of plant biodiversity is important. It's vital for food security. It's vital it will become vital for health. The World Health Organization is promoting the inclusion of traditional methods of healing into our healthcare system so that we become more resilient and less dependent. So we need to take our programs into civil society on respectful platforms and engage them, give them the knowledge on which they can become investors in contributing to our conservation targets.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Dr. Peter. Now, I spoke about Coral in detail, and thank you for that dive again. Yes, they're wonderful. And you know, Susan, she's always very passionate about the work that she does. And we need these passionate people at the heart of anything that we're going to do to develop our region. And so, Susan, could you share with us some of the mechanisms that you think should be in place to ensure transparency, accountability, and monitoring of these debt for nature swap agreements? Because we need to ensure that that's built in, right? And it has to be built in because when you look at implementation, if you don't have proper accountability, you never get to the implementation targets that you want, right? You go ahead.
So what I would say is that they're mostly already in place, actually, because Coral is a charitable organization, and as a charity, you have to report to the government in terms of your finance, everything to do with your finances and so on. So that's already in place. In fact, Minister Strawn, one of the most direct debt for nature swaps is when you contribute to a charity. So, you know, instead of paying to the Treasury, you don't know where it's going, you can make a donation to Coral, and you know where your money is going. It's going to nature. So that in terms, we have to be very accountable in that, of course, because you couldn't operate as a charity and not cheat people. So that's one thing. We also, as a charity, we're registered with the Barbados Revenue Authority. So we actually don't have to pay taxes as a charity ourselves. So that's already a benefit that we have. Now, in terms of the other, the monitoring and so on of our activities that Dr. Bino asked about.
Sorry, Susan.
Yes.
I was speaking in the context of the overall debt for nature swap, right?
Yes.
What role can civil society play in ensuring that there's accountability, that there's transparency in the actual process itself? And not only in the context of Barbados, but we're speaking generally in the Caribbean region.
Right. So, well, first you have to do as you wish others to do. So, certainly on the level of we have to get permits from the government, and so the government will be informed all the time of what we're doing, and they come and inspect and so on. So we can't just willy-nilly go and take corals and plant them somewhere. But in terms of the actual process of the debt for nature swap. We were invited to all the stakeholder meetings that preceded all of these negotiations. So we represented Coral.
Yeah, it's important that you mention this because persons who are viewing online and persons here may not understand that that was a process that was involved. That yes. level of stakeholder consultation. So you can walk us through it.
Yes. So I remember in the beginning, the Nature Conservancy came and told us about what they do. The government, so at the time, Minister Kirk Humphrey, who was for the blue economy, came and explained. And there was set up a board of people that was agreed with everybody. So with civil society, the government, the Nature Conservancy, the members of the bank, different kinds of banks who were there, all agreed who was going to be on the board, the governing board. So as we mentioned, the government is on the board, the University of the West Indies is on the board, and the Nature Conservancy, in this particular instance, for this debt for nature swap. And it was actually agreed with all. So we had everybody there. We had, the Barbados Sea Turtle Project. There was the Barbados National Trust. There was a museum there, in terms of civil society. And we all agreed that's, and then there'll be a technical advisory committee and that will be rotating members to a certain extent. So there won't be any conflict of interest So that was an important thing, because some organization, for example, like Coral, would like to access the funding from the for the debt for nature swap, but we wouldn't want to be on the board, and then not be eligible for funding. So that's important too, and so it was a participatory, agreed process, and now we're at the stage where, the first disbursements that we heard on the UN radio announcement was going to be sometime next year, hopefully, as far as we know. And we hope that different, civil society organizations will be eligible then to, obviously we hope that Coral will be eligible.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Now, the whole reason for this is a discussion, and very often you have panel discussions, and persons like myself answer all the questions, and the audience doesn't really get an opportunity to do so. So I'll ask one final question and then open up to the audience, so that you can answer the questions that may be burning on your minds to pose to this very distinguished panel. Mr. Strawn, I'm sure that there's some key lessons that would have been learned from this whole process, in addition to what you already shared with us. So I just want you to share some of those very key lessons learned. This may be an SGB thing. We love lessons learned. We love getting out there. So some key lessons learned that you can leave with the public, those who are listening here and those listening online.
Yes, thanks very much. And I just want to pick up on where Susan left off in relation to accessing resources from the fund, because clearly there were some milestones that were agreed as part of the process. And it took a little bit of re-engineering, if you like, in the minds of even our public service about how this was going to happen, because ordinarily the Ministry of Finance would just, in the budget, say this line item is for that and is under agency Y, and you go off and do what you have to do. So even though, the government is on the board, wanting to execute these projects as agreed, and therefore having the right partners to be able to execute given the mandate that is given is important. So even internally, just the process of sitting down with other stakeholders and deciding on who is going to do what, when, and where, which is not normally the case from a budgetary perspective, is something that the Ministry of Environment just had to just a slightly different orientation, which wasn't necessarily clearly understood at the beginning, because once you've agreed this is the process to engage, then that is important for us to be able to make sure it happens. I think from the point you were asking in terms of how civil society will hold the process to account, because I think it is important to realize that whilst government has a very clear responsibility from a regulatory and fiduciary responsibility, generally speaking, so coastal zone has to do its job as coastal zone. There's no getting around that. But working with partners now to be able to reach the milestones is really what is critical, where civil society then comes in, as well as the persons who actively on a day-to-day basis go besides the regulatory agencies, now having to make sure then that this technical work is done in conjunction with that is also is important. But I know that there's a very close-knit community clearly within this marine conservation space, and I feel that one of the things that we have to ensure, and I think you mentioned in relation to jobs, is opening up the space now for a lot of persons to participate.
That's it.
Beyond what the current scope may be, because as things start to ramp up, that's why I said earlier, we are going to, and without duplication, because it is my contemplation that we don't go and set up a different fund, a different trust to do everything, that we try to make sure the existing structure can, yes, deliver on its main mandate, but as we do a debt for climate swap or any other thing that will happen in the future, we really do have to make sure that we streamline the administration as much as we can, because rather than go and having people serve on different things, we have to be coherent with the policy, with the implementation, in order to make sure that this can work. So with persons who are actively participating in executing, obviously if there's no, once you need to manage any conflict that may arise, because you're a small country with limited resources, and therefore you would expect that from time to time there will be some conflict, but you can manage that to ensure that the objectives are still met in relation to the very important milestones that were achieved. So civil society, I think, has a role to play in not just holding the process to account, but actually making it happen. Yes. And I think we have to figure that out because it wouldn't make sense us discarding the expertise that we already have to bring people blind into a process, which is then potentially where you can have issues arise. So it's the management of, when I say management of conflict, it's just you happen to be working in this space, and therefore you have an interest there. Once that's declared, then you can manage whatever may arise. And therefore I think is those types of lessons that we all have to accept will be there. And how that is done, I think, will determine how successful the whole exercise is.
Perfect. So at this time, we'll open up to members of the audience to answer some questions. We have a microphone there in the center. I see this hand here first from Bahamas, and then we have another lady here from the Biodiversity Conservation Fund. And we look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon, and
Good afternoon.
Thank you so very much. An excellent discussion. I have 2 comments and then 2 quick questions. First, congratulations on this participatory process and on the governance structure. My first question relates to the governance structure. Does it still exist now that the debt swap has been completed? And what would be the role of the governance structure as you go forward? And my second question is for Dr. Borg, I think. Could you give us a little bit more detail on how the economic valuation that you mentioned, which I totally applaud, how does it fit into the debt swap? What are the parameters, I guess, that would, in the context of a debt swap, how does the evaluation fit in that? I'm trying to wrap my mind around that question.
The BESF is set up specifically to oversee the management and execution of the fund, and obviously who will execute on achieving the specific milestones. So yes, once if my memory serves me correctly, September of last year, we established it formally, university, government, as well as TNC. So for the next 15 years, that would be the structure in place as monies are moved from the consolidated fund into there to ensure that the milestones can be met. So that structure will be there until it comes to the end in 2038, 37. Well, we put in the first money this year, so anyhow, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. But so that will be the structure in place unless there's a change. Let me just say something very quickly. 23 years ago, myself and the current general manager of the NCC, he was at Coastal Zone, I was at Central Bank, and we were trying to develop a willingness to pay mechanism. Yeah. For valuing environmental assets in Barbados. And the idea for a Beijing of paying, and this is before sargasm and all this, clearly, of paying for conservation is actually a very, very interesting dynamic, because persons would like to go to the beach and there's easy access, it's clean, it's blue, it's everything, but there's a cost to maintaining that. And therefore the management of the coral reefs and everything that we do on land impacts that. So I think throughout this process we need to make sure that not just the models, but people understand. That's why I said the taxation and the quality of services that you're getting, there has to be a clear link between what people understand they're paying for, so without prejudice to whatever valuation model may be used, to ensure that persons can have access to environmental services, if you like, in a way that's sustainable. But it is a difficult process. Determining willingness to pay, and then once you determine what that is, then obviously it means you have to come to us to figure out how that works. But I will leave my colleague to finish that thought.
Thank you for that complicated. Just to follow up on your point, I mean, the whole idea of paying for ecosystem services is something that it's a paradigm change for us in the Caribbean and for the rest of the world as well. It will take quite a lot of education with the different actors and explaining to the technocrats who have to make the everyday decisions, how this is actually beneficial to us. And it's essentially beneficial because the environment doesn't play into the market. It doesn't take into consideration, GDP doesn't take into consideration the environment. And so that kind of resource needs to enter the economic and financial decision making, just like a building or a car or any kind of investment. It doesn't, and therefore it's underpriced. So in the whole debt for nature swaps, we need to come up with some estimate of, for example, the value of that mangrove, and therefore how much would be fair for us to have that swap, how much money that would essentially bring into us, how much we need to conserve. So you need almost like a measure, right? And if you don't have a measure, then you're just kind of making it up, And as accurate as you can get to that measure, it means that our decisions are going to be more accurate. It means that we have the right measures for the politicians and the policymakers to be able to prioritize, because resources are limited. And so they've got to prioritize. Do we save the mangrove or do we save the seagrass? We don't have unlimited resources. And to be able to do that, they need the economic side of the equation along with the social side of the equation to be able to make the right decision for their long-term development objectives.
So you're saying two things. You want to know first whether the transaction makes sense at the high macro level. And then the second thing you're saying, within the context of the conditions of the swap, where should the funding flows be directed? Did I summarize it correctly?
In terms of identifying, it helps to identify when you have the valuation of the resources. It helps the policymakers to make a decision as to where the funding should go.
Gotcha. Is there any formula that you are aware of that we can use as countries that would consider these economic valuations? Not the valuation themselves, but how do they pull into these decisions, especially for our policymakers?
There are a number of methodologies. One of the ones that consider the economic and the social ones is something called multi-criteria analysis.
Okay.
But it all depends on the type of use you are valuing. So you could have non-use and you could have use. Meaning, so use is like similar to the willingness to pay.
Yeah.
So even though that's a stated preference method where people are stating what they would be willing to pay to enter a beach or to participate in a beach activity, and then you can extrapolate those particular estimates to give what is called stated preference. It means that you're trying to figure out in the future what's the value of that resource to the country.
Just quickly,
Thank you.
You're welcome. And just add very quickly, because when you have an ecosystem service, it has a value, and if it's repaired, if it's healed, if you improve it, it's able to produce more of that service. So that's another component that is missing. As we conserve and the ecosystem becomes more healthy, how do we value that contribution in terms of payback? Because with ESGs, more companies will be able to then to use that value to show on their balance sheets, right? And therefore, if you're floating a bond, a blue bond or even a green bond, and you can value and put it in there, it's going to make the bond more appealing at the same time, right? We have a question here, then you just want to make a quick contribution concerning what was said there. Is that the case?
I think she has a question.
In relation to what was said there just now? Yeah, just quickly, yeah.
Making sure we have the values of future generations, right? So for example, I gave an example in my speech earlier. When we invest in freight transportation, there are sediments. If we're going to address those sediments, if we're going to address the environmental consequences, the consequences on biodiversity, the consequences on habitat, we have to add that to the price.
That's important.
And it's not just the price of the service, it's also the price of investment. So to complicate your life further, when you are looking at the national investments that the government will prioritize from the climate change fund that you will establish, or from SDRs that you will program, what is the cost of the ocean non-life investments versus the cost to ocean life investments? So I gave the example also earlier on fisheries. What is the cost of overfishing to the depletion of specific fish species? And what would be the cost to replenish them? That has to be factored. What is the cost to making the fisheries sector more efficient versus the cost of fish loss in an inefficient sector? How do you factor in that price? And that's the bigger meaning that we're trying to achieve. And as UNDP, I mean, this whole GDP world reference conversation was shifted through the Human Development Report to include human development, not economics. So now how do we add that environmental and natural resource layer to that and really understand it as a whole, as totality? And that's the only way where the investments on the swap can hopefully balance out some of the things that are being done through other man-made investments.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. You waited very patiently. Can you give me your name and the organization you represent?
Thank you, David. My name is Pat Shako. I'm Climate and Disaster Resilience Advisor for the UK government working with FCDO. But it is emotional for me to be here today because, like Minister Strong, I was on the beach having conversations with colleagues on ecosystem services. I am a frustrated natural resource economist. When my degree was newly minted and I arrived out of University of London, ready to work, I was told that nobody wanted to know the value of ecosystem services. Nobody could understand why this information was important. I'm also emotional today because I used to head up the program at the Nature Conservancy and proposed that Barbados would be a good starting place for a Debt for Nature swap. Wow. And I am really, really excited. Congratulations to Barbados for getting us to this point. But as our colleague said, we have a long way to go in terms of data, in terms of resources for valuation so that we have proper cost-benefit streams. But the question I wanted to ask was, Minister Strong, when we talk about blue bonds, I remember the Prime Minister here talking about unlocking savings of the diaspora in participation for growth and transformation in our region. And I wanted to ask, did the Government of Barbados have any thoughts on how this facility may look at unlocking savings in the diaspora and leveraging finances, not in the private sector writ large, but at the household level, and the opportunities for education for the average person on why this work is important?
So, initially when we came to office, we had a very strong desire, we still do, to leverage resources both within the diaspora as well as mobilizing domestic private resources, because it's important that as we articulate in the recovery, that we include people as part of any return on investment, that we have as many people participate in that as possible. And of course, COVID came and we had to focus on the very basics. But now we are contemplating it again, more so within the climate space, especially because there's been a lot happening in that space that allows us now to pivot and be very laser-like. Now, you would notice that we've had to pause on, particularly on renewable energy and its implementation, because if you would appreciate that in a small country with its history, the persons with the immediate resources are not necessarily the masses. Mm-hmm. That's both land and financial resources. So part of the reason that we have given a very specific mandate that it needs to be domestic participation in any RE project, and domestic meaning en masse, whether that means having cooperatives or credit unions involved because of that architecture, is important, such that the whole point of being environmentally friendly makes sense for the ecosystem to thrive. So we have been contemplating a couple of things in relation to the diaspora, because we want, like we've been doing with renewable energy, if the investment is going to come in, we want as much of the return to stay in the country rather than foreign investment come in using the natural resources, and then all of the profits then are repatriated on the basis of what is taking place here. So we've been very deliberate and very careful around that, because we could achieve relatively low levels of electricity by having someone go and do everything, but then all of the profits then will be exported, which doesn't help us. So we're very clear that we have to pause and make sure we get it right to have as many people participate as possible. So as it relates to the diaspora and the green or blue bonds, as appropriate, then we would want to do a similar thing where obviously they can invest in foreign currency but be paid in local currency, as we are working with some of our development partners to see how we can facilitate. Because from an RE perspective, it really doesn't make sense to have a foreign exchange drain if all of the investment comes from outside. So we probably get a little cursing because things are not moving as quickly as it should. But if we don't do that, then it means then that the patrimony of the country then will be foreign owned. Not that there's anything wrong with foreign direct investment, but on this very important matter, is important for the sustainability of the country going forward. Now, last year, for example, we spent $1.1 billion importing fuel, 430 odd more than we did in 2019, right? Which was the last normal year. Now, I would rather have spent that 400 million on putting in RE to save us from having to spend that money again in the future, because all that happened was that the oil price went up. That's all that happened. Yes, we put in some additional infrastructure, but not fast enough to really shield us from that. So it's important, and I hope people appreciate, it's important that for sustainability purposes, any blue bond, green bond, any structure that we do now strategically really has to safeguard the country. So in the same way that we're trying to deal with marine conservation and getting the environment right, if we don't get the financial architecture right as well, then it could either easily consolidate into a few hands, which then perpetuates historical inequity. And if we're going to be sustainable with our thoughts and how we do things, then we really do have to ensure that in the first instance, that whether credit unions or co-ops or whatever that have the capacity en masse, that they get the opportunity to be there to do the financing that will deliver then dividends to ordinary citizens. And so in the context of the diaspora, we're working to see how we can borrow in foreign currency but pay in domestic currency, because you're Beijing, so it makes sense. And therefore have a mechanism that works in the interest, the long-term interest of the country. I hope that answers your question.
That's brilliant. It's brilliant. We'll take one last question here, and then we'll close because we're just over time.
Thank you. We're in afternoon,
Yes.
everybody. Karen McDonald-Gill, and I'm with the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. I think one of the comments I wanted to make to David's question of lessons learned is having a Minister of Finance on the panel. and it boils down to political will. So the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has worked with a range of governments and partners to create a number of national conservation trust funds and to work in the region on ideas for financing mechanisms. And Barbados has led. We are not directly working with you yet. We're going to work more closely with Gregory on opportunities. But by far, the political will and the engagement of the government and what you've heard the Minister able to articulate here is such a big part of bringing the game forward. In my former life, I worked with a fund that did go through a debt for nature process with the US government many years ago. And it was a long, tedious process where I think a lot of it was, show me where the debt is. Show me what you're going to do with the debt in the discussions that you're trying to have and how it works. So the very proactive idea and work of the Barbados government is to be applauded. And the next key factor is to make sure that it's long-term, which is the discussion of how long will you be receiving money, what will happen with the funds, beyond any one political party or political movement. How is it better for the national development? And I think that's some of the struggles that some of the governments have had in thinking longer term, thinking beyond debt, the discussions of debt recovery at the time, and moving it forward to that bigger political discussion. So the Conservation Trust Fund concept came about from that in one space, the opposition or whichever other entities, national leaders are working together from now to say what needs to be done with the money that is being held for the government. So again, just to echo the applause on the work of the Barbados government, but also any ideas on how we get other governments who are more traditional to think along the lines and to become some of the persons on the panels and discussions such as this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. And so finally, we'll close at this point by giving you some final words of wisdom from the panelists. We'll start with Susan, then we'll come straight down to Minister Strawn, and we'll conclude.
Words of wisdom.
And I know you have a lot of that.
Does that mean I'm old?
Not at all.
Actually, I think this is absolutely fantastic. I don't have any words of wisdom except to say that this is to echo what was said just now, is to have everybody, people who are in the financial sector and the doers. We are the doers from the civil society. We're going to make it happen, is to have everybody together. And it was a pleasure to host you and Taya on the diving expedition yesterday. And I think it's important for people to see and to do in order to understand what's required for for conserving biodiversity. And last thing is that there wasn't a specific link between biodiversity and poverty, and I know that the UN has done quite a bit of work on that. It's only common sense that if you don't have biodiversity, you're going to have poverty of people. So that's my final word on that. It's absolutely vital to have conserved biodiversity.
As wise as always. Thank you. We can go over to Delbari Board.
Hi.
Nisha.
Thank you, David.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much to the panel as well as to the audience. In terms of final words, I would say traditionally we're looking at the typical conservation actions such as marine protection, biodiversity protection with mangroves, seagrasses, etc. But I think we also need to look at the value of our productive land. So we have a lot of agricultural land sitting down in SIDS, and that's underutilized. and perhaps some of those resources could also come into the equation. It comes back to the same issue of actually being able to value it and engaging our farmers who are utilizing it. And the second thing would be to try to work to undertake subsidy reforms. We know that we lose about $116 billion a year from the OECD in terms of what we lose in terms of focusing on agricultural subsidies. We don't need to underprice the environment. In fact, it should be priced, as I've said a few times. So those are my only two things.
Excellent.
So continuing to do that and really rally for that for the region.
Thank you for that, Nisha. Peter?
Yes, thank you, David.
You're most welcome.
And thank you all for assisting with us. I think lunch is around the corner. I want to support Susan in terms of the importance of civil society. With respect to the Swap for Nature, civil society will be the conduit, will act as the negotiator between the mechanisms and the communities and the people who really are the benefactors of these swaps. I want to make a plug in terms of evaluation for our regional endemicity. We hear it touted about the Caribbean being a biodiversity hotspot, but we really do not know how hot, to be quite honest. I think that the degree of endemicity indicates for novel biochemistry within the plants. There may be novel foods that we know nothing about with respect to food security. Definitely novel compounds that could be of importance in our health management, and that healthcare building is also burgeoning. So I want to push, as I always say, that we need to create our own data sets. And when we are engaged in these swaps, we also need to guarantee that we are creating that information that will inform how the swap goes and where it really goes to be impactful. So I want to see that some of that funding goes to civil society that is working within the sphere of plant biodiversity, endemicity, and evaluating that. And maybe I can work with you in terms of, the evaluation mechanisms. And again, I am quite excited to know about, the mechanisms, and I want to really compliment our minister because he has really enlightened me in terms of how much work has gone in and where we can go in the future. Thank you.
Excellent. So we started with Minister Strawn and we'll end with him. Minister Strawn, you said a lot, and I'm sure that you can basically encapsulate, some of what you've said before, but leave us some final words of wisdom that can inspire other governments around the region to follow suit, as you have so ably done in terms of leading by example with the swap that you would have accomplished.
Yeah, thanks so much, David, and I really enjoyed being here this morning. From a regional perspective, I think it's important that we build that capacity internally. And I was having a conversation with the Minister of Finance from Belize, for example. They've been doing some wonderful work with their seagrasses, seaweed, not seagrass, seaweed. And the reality is that we don't have enough data, I believe, in the region to really value what we have. And I think we really do need to solve that problem, because irrespective of what each government may or may not do, given that the marine space really is common to all of us, that is something that we would work collaboratively with CARICOM to see how we can develop a framework that makes sense for the region. Certainly Barbados will continue to work with our partners locally to improve what we need to do for our citizens, but you accept that in a rapidly changing environment that there must be consistency, we feel, across the region so that we can leverage as much resources as possible to bring to bear to this challenge. And if we can solve that by sharing some resources across the region, then I think that's something that we would welcome. One of the areas that I didn't mention, which I will do so here now, is we have received a couple of proposals to do some carbon offsets. But the question is, how do you value those carbon offsets given what is happening, not just in Barbados, but across the region? And therefore, before we could go ahead and say, yes, let's sign on the dotted line, and I think the point you're making about the valuation of it, that's something that we are actively working with our colleagues across the region to see how we can implement that, because in addition to what the local may be willing to pay, there are those who visit us who are becoming more and more environmentally conscious, and therefore would want to offset, and therefore that's a mechanism that we feel that once we can have a very clearly articulated view of what is the value of it and what is how we can price that, then I think we can come to a sensible conclusion on that and monitor to see whether or not that makes sense. But these are our discussions that we as finance ministers have, and I must tell you that 5 years ago we were not having those conversations. This would be meaning within the finance space. I've seen a very rapid evolution of that change. So it has happened. There's no finance meeting that I've gone to in the last 3 years that these issues are not a critical part of the agenda. So even in that short time, I've seen a lot happen. We would love to see things happen faster, and certainly Barbados will continue to push and push and push and push to make sure that as SIDS and within the Caribbean region, that we can continue to carve out that policy space, because our vulnerability is not just on climate, but a range of areas, but to ensure that our vulnerability is taken into consideration in relation to what is happening. And I look forward to working with UNDP and others for carving out that space, not just for Barbados, but certainly for the Caribbean region. So thank you very much.
Amazing.
I had a great time.
That's are indeed like children, begot with pleasure, but brought forth with pain. Now, definition swaps can help us soothe some of this pain. We can. You know, they do this as we explored this morning and some of this afternoon by filling the sustainable financing gap. That's how they help us soothe some of this pain that we're talking about. Assisting us in financing nature and giving fiscal space to governments, thus allowing them to direct resources, as Minister Strawn pointed out, to areas that safeguard the environment, protect the fabric of society, while maintaining economic growth. This sustainable financing gap that we spoke about and financing nature, it's wide. And the public sector cannot do it alone. And I think we can conclude that based on the discussion we had today. Debt for nature swaps, if created, negotiated, and developed appropriately, they can provide a unique solution. You know, a solution that intertwines, as I said earlier, between environmental conservation and social inclusion with economic debt relief. Thank you very much to my distinguished panel.
Thank you.